The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of 8 News Now or Nexstar Media Group.
On Politics Now, elections, education, and immigration. We look through a host of new bills introduced this week up in Carson City.
The idea is to create a system of integrity around esports generally that would allow for consumer and player confidence.
The future of gaming. State Senator Ben Kiefer details his plan to create the country's first esports regulatory body. Plus,
I expect that we will move to a primary system. I think the caucus has disenfranchised a lot of voters.
Is change coming? We speak with the new chair of the Nevada Democratic Party about her vision for the future.
From 8 News Now, this is Politics Now.
Thank you very much for joining us. I'm John Langler, and we start in Carson City, where the Nevada legislative session is chugging along. Hundreds of new bills were introduced this week. Monday was the original deadline to introduce legislation, but now that's been suspended. So let's talk about some of the main measures. Many of the new bills deal with elections. Senate Bill 292 was introduced by Democrat Roberta Lang. It would allow straight ticket voting. You could basically just check a box that says Republican or Democrat, and all of the candidates would then get your vote. This also raises the requirements for minor parties to qualify for the ballot. County commissioners would not name replacements to seats in the legislature. Instead, that would go to the head of that chamber, whether it's the Senate or the Assembly. That's proposed in this bill. Republican State Senator Scott Hammond is trying to revive education savings accounts, ESAs. Senate Bill 306 would allow families to take public school money for their child and then spend it on a private school. Republicans approved this measure in 2015. After a lengthy legal battle, it was defeated when Democrats took control, and they still oppose this now. The bill sets aside $60 million to fund ESAs. A bill by Democrat State Senator Dina Neal would cap fees charged by online food delivery platforms. Senate Bill 320 sets the maximum at 20% of an order on Postmates, Grubhub, or other delivery sites or apps. It also adds in civil penalties if those platforms offer to deliver food without that restaurant's approval. Now, if you've been driving around, you'll see sort of beat up junk cars, vintage cars with those classic car plates you see there. So this is a story the I-Teams reported on in the past. Assembly Bill 349 from Democrat Howard Watts would close the loophole that allows that. Right now, any vehicle older than 20 years can get those classic plates, and it also exempts them from smog checks. The bill would limit them to only being able to drive 5,000 miles on the road in a year. Vintage vehicles would also need antique car insurance and would require antique car insurance policy. I beg your pardon, I said that twice. The bill also raises fees on smog businesses, again, if approved. Assembly Bill 376 would keep local police departments from cooperating with federal immigration officials. The measure was introduced by Democrat Selena Torres. It bars law enforcement from detaining someone at the request of immigration officials unless there's a warrant. Officers would have to warn people that answers to their questions about their birthplace could be used against them in deportation proceedings. Former State Senator Ivana Kinsella tried to pass a similar bill in 2017. A bill to change use of force rules for police officers had its first hearing this week. It's Senate Bill 212, sponsored by Democrat Dallas Harris. It would make it harder for police to use deadly force, have them stay a certain distance away from suspects to encourage de-escalation, and it also has limits for protests and demonstrations. Police would have to give an order to disperse and enough time for those people to clear before they can use non-lethal force, pepper balls, for example. Senator Harris says half of police shootings were deadly in 2019 and used a slide in the presentation saying Reno, Nevada, for example, is one of 7 major cities where police kill black men at a higher rate than the U.S. murder rate. Republican senators believe this bill presentation was unbalanced.
It's pretty accusatory. The presentation was such that it sounded like, police officers, I mean, we're stopping short of a defund police argument, but it sounded like, these are our bad guys, and for Pete's sake, these guys keep us safe. And they're the ones who run toward the danger instead of away from it. And I think they deserve a great deal of respect for that.
Again, if approved, this measure would also have the Attorney General create a use of force database. The bill has not yet had a vote. Assembly Speaker Jason Fryerson says he is recovering from surgery now as he battles prostate cancer. He returned to the legislature this week. Fryerson says he was diagnosed with the cancer 2 years ago, and he has introduced a bill that would make September Prostate and Ovarian Cancer Awareness Month. Our Vanessa Murphy spoke with him about his treatment.
Men, when it comes to these types of procedures, get skittish, and you're a mother. My wife has 2 kids. I'm frequently reminded of how I don't know childbirth. And so for something as simple as having your prostate checked, it's just a no-brainer. And it's such a typically non-aggressive form of cancer that it's so treatable if you're willing to talk about it. So, these are not the kinds of things that people, are comfortable talking about. So let's normalize it. Let's make it comfortable to talk about, not embarrassing. There's side effects that we need to talk about so that we can, weigh those in our consideration. But I think that the more that we talk about it, the more folks will be comfortable addressing it. And, you'd be amazed at the number of people, even over the past week, that are comfortable talking to me about, their private issues and challenges.
Speaker Fryerson is now getting cutting-edge cryotherapy treatment in California. The Nevada Democratic Party has new leadership. It's led by a slate of members from the Democratic Socialists of America. Judith Whitmer is the new state party chair. Several members of the existing party administration have now quit with the turnover. It has sparked national headlines about a potential socialist takeover of the Democratic Party in Nevada. I spoke with Whitmer about her new position and what's next.
There's always been, this a little bit of a divide between, what direction each faction wants to take the party. But at the end of the day, we're all Democrats, and we will unify and we will elect Democrats. That's what we're here for. So we know that no progress is possible without electing Democrats. So progressives are very invested in making sure that happens. And we're also invested in bringing everyone together to make sure that we are ready in 2022. Because to us, it's an absolute necessity that we re-elect Governor Sisolak and Senator Cortez Masto. And we have a Senate majority. We're not going to give that up. We're absolutely not going to give that up. So we are here to do the work. And I think once everybody sees that we're doing the work, to keep the Democratic Party not only functioning, but also expanding and growing the Democratic Party to include all different ideologies, and also making sure that we're doing the outreach and the community engagement and BIPOC communities as well.
So you're not concerned about, again, the quote establishment Democrats kind of working around your own team?
Well, I would highly caution against that, because the state Democratic Party is the only effective structure for electing Democrats and for doing that kind of work, especially working with the coordinated campaign. We're very closely aligned with the DNC right now. We are, doing the work already. We're open for business. And so it's not to the benefit of our Democratic candidates for there to be any kind of a divide or for any kind of a workaround, because it puts them at risk and it puts our elections at risk. So it's very, very important that we are all working together. We're all on the same page. And I understand, the little bit of concern there always is when there's transition or new leadership. But I'm here to elect Democrats. That's my primary job.
Are you looking ahead already to having a caucus, how that'll be given the changes for the next election?
I expect that we will move to a primary system. I think the caucus has disenfranchised a lot of voters, although they were helpful in rural areas to bring people together. We were finding that, a lot of people found it difficult to participate on caucus day or weren't really comfortable participating in that kind of a format, even with the early voting. We saw that a lot of people early voted and stood in line for hours to cast their ballot, and so that tells us that people don't really like the caucus system. And we've got to move to a primary system here in Nevada.
What's one big outside the box thing that you want to do right away?
We're restructuring our Get Out the Vote to make it more manageable and to make it more personal. We're going to be doing a lot of Zoom until we can do in-person events at each level, so that we're going to try and get our candidates to engage with people earlier on, not just at election time, and start holding like town halls in every single district, so that we're engaging people now, not waiting until election time, and that people start to feel like they can give that kind of input, hold Q&As. We're also looking at new texting technology, new voicemail technology.
And we've put the entire interview with Judith Whitmer at 8newsnow.com. Incidentally, she mentioned BIPOC in the interview. That is an acronym for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. That's a term being increasingly used by progressive Democrats. Coming up next on Politics Now, could we switch to open primaries?
I think that's a system that recognizes the fact that people are turning away from the two major political parties.
Republican State Senator Ben Kiefer tells us about the realities of voters behind his election reform bill. And will gun control legislation pass? We're going to look at some laws being discussed after two recent mass shootings here in our country.
Welcome back to Politics Now.
Republican State Senator Ben Kiefer has been at the forefront of legislation to try and help Nevada adopt new technology, from blockchain to cryptocurrency and to esports. I spoke with him about one of his election reform bills and his attempts to create the country's first esports commission.
Why does esports need regulation in Nevada?
I'm coming to this clearly and very, very focused as an economic development bill, right? So I think that esports, as the fastest growing segment of the entertainment industry and sports industry, is uniquely positioned to fit perfectly with Las Vegas to create additional tourism, additional technology ecosystem, and additional remote work. So those are sort of three lanes of an economic development platform that we've agreed to at the highest levels of this state, from the governor on down. And esports fits all of those lanes perfectly. So what this bill is modeled on is a Nevada Athletic Commission type of body, right?
What are they going to regulate? Is it the human component? Is it the technical component? What can a commission actually do when the actual event, while maybe taking place in Las Vegas, it's kind of everywhere?
There are both online tournaments and in-person events, right? And I think we need to start by looking at those in-person events. Because something that's held totally online, we would really have no jurisdiction over, right? So there has to be a nexus for us to have some oversight for it. So I think, the effort is to create a partnership between the state and the Nevada Esports Commission and industry to both identify issues that would be more appropriate for a commission to oversee, as well as get those implemented. So those could be things like setting up standards for competition and developing those so that they're applied uniformly across different types of competitions. It could be enforcement of things like team roster changes or something to that effect, so that people know what's to be expected for those levels of competition. The bill specifically calls out drug testing potentially as something that the commission could oversee. So the idea is to create a system of integrity around esports generally that would allow for consumer and player confidence.
There's been a lot of discussion about what happened with the last election, the primary and the general election, with the coronavirus and how the changes that were made to ensure safety and so forth. Back then, the Secretary of State's office suggested that this was going to be the only time we did the only mail-in balloting. That was sort of the general thought there. What do you think, or what are you proposing?
I think we also need to look at the changing reality of our electorate and not just our election system. And I've proposed in Senate Bill 121, recognizing the fact that more than a third or more than 30% of the voters in the state of Nevada have decided not to be a member of the Republican or Democratic parties. And primaries most often decide elections. I think we know that. We've seen that. And for the fact that our closed primary system doesn't allow nonpartisans and minor party members to participate in the most important election of the cycle, they effectively get shut out of choosing who represents them in their government. So I'm proposing an open primary system. It's a blanket primary that allows all voters to participate in primary elections. And it really changes how we have to think about our primaries. We're no longer having a primary that chooses a Democratic candidate and chooses a Republican candidate. We have all voters choose to choose who they want to go through to the general election. All candidates go on one ballot. All voters get to vote. The top two go through to the general election, and then winner takes all. I think that's a system that recognizes the fact that people are turning away from the two major political parties, and it would give a stronger voice to more people in this state to elect their representatives in government, and hopefully bring us more together.
Well, we have a lot more of that interview with Senator Kiefer, including more on election reform suggestions and how to try and fix Dieter. You can see that interview at 8newsnow.com. So that open primary bill, it's quite a contrast to the straight party ticket voting that we talked about earlier in the show, that measure that's been proposed. We counted, in fact, at least 30 election-related bills so far up in Carson City. Others include putting in ranked choice voting, moving to all mail, and expanding voting districts. Another bill would amend the Nevada Constitution to put some teeth into the state's none of the above option, which is unique to Nevada. If none of the above win a primary, for example, then that party would have to pick a candidate not on the ballot. And then if the candidate won in the general election, a special election would be called. We'll keep an eye on all of that because there's a lot of moving pieces. Next on Politics Now, working across the aisle, Nevada Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen discusses her efforts to pair with a Republican senator and try and get things done. This is 8 News Now.
Following another mass shooting, lawmakers debate whether more federal gun laws are needed.
You're watching Politics Now.
After two mass shootings in the span of less than a week, gun control legislation is once again coming up in Congress. On Monday, 10 people were killed in Boulder, Colorado at a grocery store. Last week, 8 people died in a string of shootings in Atlanta, Georgia. 2 bills have now passed the House in Washington, D.C., but now they're in the bitterly divided Senate.
I've already committed to bringing universal background checks legislation to the floor of the Senate.
When you disarm law-abiding citizens, you make them more likely to be victims.
These shootings have brought the issues of gun control to the forefront once again in Washington. Even before the shootings happened, in fact, Democrats were considering federal gun law changes. And as you see, our Washington correspondent Alexandra Limon is here to discuss details of these proposals. Alexandra, what's included on Capitol Hill?
The U.S. House actually already passed 2 different gun control measures. One calls for near universal background checks with a few exceptions that allows for transfers between family members.
What kind of opposition will Democrats see on Capitol Hill from Republicans? What do lawmakers on the GOP side have to say about this?
Near total opposition from the Republican side, and that's obviously going to become probably an insurmountable obstacle in the U.S. Senate, because obviously they need 60 votes to get any of these measures through the Senate, and Democrats have nowhere near that amount of votes or support for these measures. But despite that, Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has promised that he will be calling for votes on the Senate floor on the background check bills at a minimum. And he says that's because polls show that 90% of Americans support these bills, including a majority of Republicans and a majority of gun owners. So I think what's happening here is that Democrats are trying to exert some both political and public pressure on Republicans to get them officially on the record on where they fall on these background check bills, and possibly even force them into a situation where they're involved in a talking filibuster on the Senate floor over this issue.
Alexandra Limon from Washington, thank you very much. So Congress is working on better coordination now between state and federal governments to try and stop domestic terrorism. This week, Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford testified before the House Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism. Ford opened his statement reflecting on our 1 October mass shooting and the standoff at the Bundy Ranch up in Bunkerville. Ford says we may need to change federal laws to better prosecute domestic tourists.
There are no easy fixes in the fight against domestic terrorism. With the rise of domestic violent extremism, there is no question that something needs to change so that we can ensure public safety. I would recommend...
Meant to say domestic terrorists, of course. Ford also says we need to take a measured approach to protect privacy, free speech, and the right to bear arms. Two senators say they're working together to buck the polarizing trend in Washington, D.C. Nevada Democrat Senator Jackie Rosen and West Virginia Republican Shelley Moore Capito. On CBS this morning, the pair said that they were trying to find ways to work together.
We don't have to be disagreeable when we disagree. We can focus on the things we agree on. That's why people send us here. That's what they expect from their leadership.
You all make it sound so easy in terms of bipartisanship. What are you doing that some of your colleagues aren't?
I think, honestly, if you're asking where I think some of our other colleagues, unnamed, could improve, I think the way we disagree sometimes is very disrespectful.
So far, the pair have co-sponsored legislation to improve broadband internet access and expand opportunities in science and technology for young women. In What to Watch, looking forward here on Politics Now, we're waiting for the next major deadline in the state legislative session up in Carson City. April 9th is the date where bills have to make it out of their first committee. It's the first key deadline, and that's where a lot of bills end up getting killed. At this point, the legislature is sticking to that deadline of April 9th and has not moved it back. We'll keep an eye on that as things move forward, or don't move forward as it turns out in Carson City. Thank you very much for watching us here on Politics Now this week. Don't forget you can stay up to date online with all the political news, 8newsnow.com. We'll see you right back here on Saturday. Thanks for watching.